What follows is a brief construction montage.
Late again.
Limited time only.
Flashback.
While Patchy pulls himself together, let's see how SpongeBob's party is shaping up.
End of flashback. Soon after. Montage. Previously.
Yesterday. Meanwhile.
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 Meanwhile, at the Krusty Krab. Meanwhile, back in the lowlands.
Meanwhile, deep in the kelp forest. Meanwhile, back on the Patrick Show. Meanwhile, at the palace of King Poseidon, ruler of the seven seas.
A few moments later.
A few moments later.
A few moments later.
Moments later. Moments later. Moments later.
Moments later.
Many moments later. Many moments later. Many unbearable moments later.
More moments later. A little later.
A little later.
A while later. A little while later.
Later. Later. Later.
Later. Later.
Later. Later. Later.
Later.
Later. Later.
Later. Later.
Later. In the void. Later still. Later that evening.
Happy friendiversary.
Later that same evening.
Later that day. Later that day. Later that same whoopsie-doodle day. Later that night.
Later that night.
Later that night. Later that night.
More laterer.
Much later.
Much later.
Much later.
Much later. Much later. Much later.
Not much later.
So much later that the old narrator got tired of waiting and they had to hire a new one.
The following Thursday.
You get the idea.
Just then, by sheer coincidence, 12 o'clock midnight, 3:28 a.m., 7:59 a.m.,
4 o'clock in the afternoon.
8:01 p.m.,
1 nanosecond later.
10 seconds later, 12 seconds later, 12 seconds later,
13 seconds later. 47 seconds later. 47 seconds later. A few seconds later. A few seconds later. 1 minute later. 1 minute later.
1 minute and 7 seconds earlier!
1 minute, 37 seconds later,
2 minutes later.
2 very boring minutes later, 5 minutes later,
5 minutes later.
5 minutes later,
5 minutes later. 10 minutes later. 10 minutes later.
10 minutes later.
11 minutes later,
11 minutes later. 15 minutes ago.
15 minutes later,
15 minutes later.
20 minutes later,
20 minutes later.
a few minutes later, a few minutes later, a little longer than a few minutes later,
Many minutes later.
1 hour later, 1 hour later,
1 hour later.
1 hour later!
1 hour later.
1 hour later!
1 hour later. 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 80 minutes later.
2 hours later.
2 hours later, 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 2 hours later,
2 hours later. 2 hours later.
3 hours later,
Can you move it along? I'm all out of time cards.
3 hours later, 3 hours later,
3 hours later. 3 hours later. 3 hours later. 3 hours later.
5 hours later,
5 hours later.
346 minutes later, 6 hours later, 6 hours later,
6 hours later.
6.5 hours later. 7 hours later. 8 hours later. 8 hours later.
9 hours later. 10 hours later.
Approximately 10 hours later.
12 sleepless hours later.
12 sleepless hours later.
14 hours later. Several hours later. 24 sleepless hours later. A few hours later. Several hard-hitting hours later. Several soda-fueled hours later.
Several song-filled hours later.
Many hours later.
Many hours later.
Many hours later. Many hours later.
Many hours of fun time later.
Many adorable hours later. Many boring hours of cleaning later.
Many chilly hours later.
Many unbearable hours later.
Tomorrow for sure. 24 hours later. 24 hours later. Early the next morning.
Stupid early the next morning.
The next morning.
The next morning.
The next morning. The next morning.
The next morning. The next morning. The next.
The next morning.
The next morning. The next morning.
The next morning.
The next morning. The next morning. The next morning. The next morning. The next morning. The next morning.
The next morning.
The next morning. The next morning. The next morning. The next morning. The next morning. Like every morning.
The next day.
The next day. The next day. The next day. The next day. The next day. The next day. The next day. The next day. The next day. The next day. The next day. The next day in a parallel universe. The very next day.
The following day. Tomorrow.
The very next evening. The next evening. The next Christmas. Next level. Days later. 1 day later. 1 full day of fatherly fun later.
Day 2. 48 hours later. 2 days later. Day 3. 72 hours later. 3 days later. 3 days later. 3 days later. 3 days later. Day 4.
4 to 6 days later. 4 to 6 more days later. 6 messy days later. Several days later.
Several days later.
Several days later. Several days later. Several long days later. Many disorderly days later.
1 week later. 1 week later.
1 week later. 1 week later. 1 week later. 1 week later. 1 week later. 1 week later. 1 smelly week later. 1 soggy week later. 1 weekend of pampering later.
2 weeks later.
2 weeks later. 2 weeks later. 2 weeks later.
16 paranoia-filled days later.
3 weeks later.
3 weeks later. 4 to 6 weeks later.
6 to 8 weeks later. Several weeks later. Several weeks later.
6 months later. 6 months later.
6 months later!
6 stinky months later.
7 months later. Several months later.
Several months later.
Many months later.
12 years later.
70 years later.
75 years later. 2,000 years later.
2,000-ish years later.
3,000 years later.
3,000 years later.
4,000-ish years later.
5 billion years later.
1 entree later. An eternity later. An eternity later.
1 eternity later. Opening night.
A couple of hours later.
A lot of boring math later.
A lot of wallpapers later.
Very boring walk later.
Many frame building attempts later. Many heartfelt traditions later. Many attempts to fix the past later. Many amusements later.
Many buckets later.
Many exam questions later. Many invitations later. Many meeps later. Many meeps later. Many memories later. Many miles later. Many repressed memories later. Many plays later. Many superstitions later. Many tic-tacs later. Many secret parties later. Many versions later.
Many wishes later.
Many painful holes later. Many toys later. Many forks later. Much tranquility later. One bus ride later. One humongous meal later. One semester later.
One season later.
8 semesters later.
One debt to society later.
One journey through space later.
One very long digestive tract later.
One load screen later.
One loading screen later. One loading screen later.
One little boost to the surface later.
One mini game later.
One pathetic sob story later. One frozen wasteland later. One long angry line later.
One beautiful Christmas morning later. One movie later.
One shift later.
One shift later.
One extremely annoying shift later. One winner later.
One nap later. One nap later. One operation later.
One pair of pants later.
One pair of pants later.
One scary rot later.
One trip to the emergency room later.
1 million zillion jillion dillion cotillion times later.
2 idiots later.
3 annoying songs later.
82 kilometers later. 237 holes later.
242 explosions later.
298 frozen patties later.
800 kajillion potatoes later.
Thousands of tears later.
3,000 whoop-whoos later.
5,000 celebrities later.
80,000 impressions later.
Would you please stop imitating me? It is starting to get very annoying.
A few inches later. Eventually. Several bad puns later.
Several bad puns later.
Several bouquets later. Several thousand ripped pants later.
Sometime later.
Even more boat building attempts later. Abracalater. Graduation day.
What if SpongeBob was gone? What if SpongeBob was gone? What if SpongeBob was gone? What if SpongeBob was gone?
First lesson, shape-shifting. Next lesson, staring. Haunting houses. Last lesson, how to pick things up.
Epilogue. Epilogue.
Game over.
I don't believe in magic. I don't believe in magic. I don't believe in magic. Oh,
The end.
Let me at him, Pop. Let me at him. Let me at him. Let me.
I don't get it.
The end.
This is a family show.
me blowing up the whole earth for shame.
Prison!
Yes, hello? I'll take your heaviest object.
Try jiggling the antenna. Oh, I can see my house from here!
Photo time! Everybody say Merry Christmas!
Today's show went in all sorts of different directions. I hope you all enjoyed it.
It sure is good to be back. Hey, PA! I'll have the usual.
Mud espresso coming right up.
And so ends another exciting episode of The Patrick Star Show. The end. Not responsible for shattered teeth.
We had overdue books too. Going on. Going on.
There's still time to do a show today.
Only if I can work with my favorite director and sister. Make me sick. The end is correct! We have a winner!
We hope you enjoyed this brief construction montage.